Angela Samota was born on September 19, 1964 in Alameda, California. She was enrolled at the Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, and was part of the Zeta Tau Alpha sorority. She was studying computer science and electrical engineering. On the night of October 12, 1984, Angela and two friends, one male and one female, went to the State Fair of Texas. Her boyfriend didn't join because he was working in construction and had to get up early the next morning. The three friends went into Rio Room Dance Club and stayed there until after midnight. Angela was very social during the outing. She was going from table to table talking to people. It also seemed like she knew just about everyone. Afterwards, Angela drove her two companions to their homes, first dropping off the male at around 1 a.m. at his apartment on Matilda Street in Lower Greenville, which was about a 5-minute walk from Angela's condo on Amasby Drive, and then the female. Angela next went by her boyfriend's apartment to say goodnight and then returned to her place. The boyfriend subsequently stated that at approximately 1:45 a.m. he got a call from Angela, who told him there was a man in her condo who asked her to use the phone in the bathroom. It was not made clear by her if the man was already there when she got home or if she allowed him to come in. "Talk to me," Angela reportedly said to her boyfriend, then said she would call him right back and hung up. When she did not call back, the boyfriend phoned her and no one answered. He drove out to her condo, but there was no response when he knocked on the door, which was locked. At that point, the boyfriend called the police. Police officers arrived at 2:17 a.m. and broke through the door. They discovered Angela's dead, bloody, and naked body on the bed. The autopsy showed that the victim had been sexually assaulted and then repeatedly stabbed, dying from wounds to her heart. For a long period of time, the police suspected an architect who was 23 years old at that time and living in a Lower Greenville apartment. He was the man who, the night of the murder, had gone out with Angela and another girl. The victim's boyfriend was reportedly also a suspect. But with no concrete evidence tying either of them to the scene, they were never charged in connection to the matter. At one point, Russell, the 23-year-old architect living about a 5-minute walk away from Angie's condo, was given a polygraph test, which he passed. Thus, the case went cold until it was reopened in 2006. In 2006, then Dallas Police Detective Linda Crum, tasked with the case, used the DNA evidence from blood, semen, and fingernail samples to try to find a match among persons with a criminal record. In 2008, the results pointed to a Donald Bess, who at the time of Angela's murder was on parole while serving a 25-year-old sentence. Donald Bess had been previously convicted in 1978 for aggravated sexual assault and aggravated kidnapping. He had been sentenced to 25 years in prison and was out on parole by 1984, when, according to the investigators, he sexually assaulted and murdered Angela. In 1985, in a case unrelated to Angela's murder, Bess was sentenced in Harris County, Texas to life imprisonment for 1 count of aggravated rape, 1 count of aggravated kidnapping, and 1 count of sexual assault. During the punishment phase of the Angela case trial in 2010, various women came forward and testified that they had also been raped by Bess. The defendant's ex-wife testified that he'd abused her and their child during their marriage. They got married in 1969 and divorced 3 years later. On the basis of the DNA match, Bess was found guilty by the jury and on June 8, 2010 received a death sentence. On March 6, 2013, the appeal filed by Bess was rejected. And 3 years later, on April 2016, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals refused an appeal submitted by Bess, upholding the findings of the Dallas County Trial Court. To this day, Donald Bess remains on death row with no execution date set. Angela's body is buried in the Llanos Cemetery in Amarillo, Texas. Lisa Marie Kimmel was born on July 18, 1969 in Covington, Tennessee, the eldest of three daughters born to Sheila and Ronald Kimmel. She was raised in Billings, Montana. Upon graduating from Billings Senior High School in 1987, Kimmel took a job managing an Arby's restaurant in Aurora, Colorado, near Denver. Kimmel's mother, Sheila, was a regional manager of the restaurant chain, and the two commuted between Billings and Denver, a distance of approximately 555 miles, weekly. During the week, Lisa and her mother resided in an apartment complex in Denver, each in her own separate apartment, and would regularly return to Billings, where Ronald and the other Kimmel children resided. On March 25, 1988, Kimmel left from Denver, heading north to her parents' home in Billings. Her mother, Sheila, had departed from Denver on a flight to Billings the day before, as she was scheduled to go on a skiing trip. En route to Billings, Kimmel planned to stop in Cody, Wyoming, along the way to pick up her boyfriend, Ed. Wyoming Highway Patrol records showed that she was stopped for speeding in Douglas, Wyoming at 9:06 p.m. While attempting to pay her ticket, Kimmel was followed to an ATM by an officer but found the machine incompatible with her debit card. The officer agreed to allow Kimmel to mail a check to the police department to pay the fine once she returned to Billings. This was the last confirmed sighting of Kimmel, though there was one unconfirmed sighting of her inside the Casper grocery store at approximately 10 p.m. that night. Kimmel was reported missing by family members the following day, March 26, when her boyfriend Ed called their home in Billings, notifying them that Lisa had never arrived to pick him up at his home in Cody. 8 days after her disappearance on April 2nd, Kimmel's body was found floating in North Platte River near Casper, Wyoming by a local fisherman. An autopsy determined that she had been bound, beaten, and raped for at least 6 days. Evidence showed that she was then taken to the old government bridge, where she was hit on the head with a blunt object, stabbed 6 times in the chest and abdomen, before being thrown into the river. The autopsy also showed that the head wound would have killed her in a matter of minutes even if she had not been stabbed. In the summer of 2002, investigators researching cold cases came across Kimmel's rape kit, and a DNA profile was developed from the seminal evidence. The FBI's CODIS database matched the DNA to a Dale Wayne Eaton, 57 years old, of Monetta, Wyoming, who was then serving time in Englewood Federal Prison in Littleton, Colorado, on an unrelated weapons charge. Eaton's DNA profile was placed in the CODIS database in 1997 after he was arrested on a separate charge. He had stopped to offer assistance to the Breeden family, whose car had broken down, but then he kidnapped the family at gunpoint. After his arrest for this kidnapping, Eaton escaped, but was later recaptured in Shoshone National Forest. At that time, he possessed a weapon, elevating his crime to the federal level. He was then incarcerated in federal prison, where he was obliged to submit a DNA sample. Eaton's next-door neighbors reported to investigators that they had seen him digging a large hole on his property in Monetta, Wyoming, approximately 75 miles from Casper. The site was excavated in the summer of 2002, and Kimmell's Honda CRX was unearthed, still bearing her distinctive Little Miss license plate. Eaton was subsequently charged with 8 crimes connected to the Kimmel case, including first-degree premeditated murder, aggravated kidnapping, aggravated robbery, first-degree sexual assault, and second-degree sexual assault. A fellow inmate, Joseph Francis Dax, testified Eaton confessed to him as follows. Kimmel offered to give Eaton a ride, and then Eaton accepted. He made sexual advances during the ride, which Kimmel did not appreciate, so she pulled over to let him out of the car. The situation then escalated to kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. Eaton was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to death on March 20, 2004. He appealed his conviction and lost. Scheduled to be put to death on February 2010, he sought and received a stay of execution in December of 2009. It was overturned in 2014. The state is again seeking the death penalty. As of 2019, he is awaiting a new sentencing hearing on death row. Eaton is currently the only inmate in Wyoming's death row. Eaton's property was awarded to the Kimmel family after a wrongful death lawsuit, and the buildings were burned to the ground on July 18, 2005, on what would have been Lisa Kimmel's 36th birthday. Anita Louise Pitto was born on March 9, 1942 in Augusta, Maine, in a family of 7 siblings. Sometime in the end of 1967, aged 25, she decided to move to Los Angeles to explore a different part of the country, as well as to try her luck in Hollywood. For several months, she faithfully communicated with her family back on the East Coast by sending them letters and postcards. In one of the letters, she told the family that she would be returning back home in May of 1968. However, that would be the very last letter that would be sent to her family. When the letters and the communications stopped, her relatives became worried and concerned, and for the next 53 years they would tirelessly search for her. On Thursday, July 23, 2020, 53 years later, investigators in Orange County, California, said they finally solved the mystery of what had happened to Mrs. Pitto. It all started on March 14, 1968, when 3 young boys playing in a large farm field in Huntington Beach found the body of a woman. She had been sexually assaulted and severely beaten, and her neck was slashed. The police officers who responded to the scene carefully preserved evidence from the field, including the smoked cigarette butt found near the victim's body. The police worked the case exhaustively, but were unable to identify the victim or her killer, and the case went cold. Then, in 2001, investigators extracted DNA from the victim's clothing and the sexual assault kit and developed a profile of an unknown male killer. Nearly 10 years later, a partial DNA profile that was taken from the cigarette butt matched the DNA from the assault kit. But still, investigators could not find the suspect. 10 years later, in 2011, blood from the victim's blouse yielded a partial DNA profile, which was entered into a missing persons database. The victim's fingerprints were also entered into state and FBI databases, but investigators could not generate leads to identify the victim. The mystery began to unravel after investigators turned to genetic genealogy, in which DNA samples are used to find relatives of suspects and eventually the suspects themselves. This technique was also used to solve rapes and murders, of dozens of California residents by a man who became known as the Golden State Killer. Investigators developed a family tree for the suspect that helped them identify as Mr. Crisco, who was not one of the initial suspects in the killing. Mr. Crisco had been discharged from the army in 1963 after he was diagnosed with positive aggressive reaction, which was defined as being quick to anger, easy to feel unjustly treated, chronically resentful, immature, and impulsive. He had a long arrest record and was married 3 times. Johnny Crisco died of throat cancer in 2015 at the age of 71 and was buried in Washington State. In early 2020, detectives, prosecutors, and forensic scientists began working on a possible family tree of the victim. With the help of Colleen Fitzpatrick, a rocket scientist turned genetic genealogist, investigators identified Mrs. Pitto through DNA matches with her siblings. Mr. Deerking, who first came across the case as a Huntington Beach police officer in the 1990s, said the meticulous collection of evidence at the original crime scene had allowed investigators to solve the crime decades later. To think back to 1968, there was not any thought of DNA, he said. But those guys who worked so hard to collect and preserve that evidence and hold Johnny accountable even in his death, that was amazing. It's a miracle. And the family had really concentrated on praying and asking for closure. In July of 2020, Mrs. Pitto was finally buried in a family plot near one of her sisters. Her simple stone marker includes the inscription, "We miss you."